April 23, 1945 dawned gray and cold over the bombed-out ruins of Nuremberg. Yet something extraordinary drifted through the acrid smoke and rubble-filled streets that morning, the rich golden aroma of fried chicken. Greta Muller pressed her face against the cracked window of her basement shelter, her stomach cramping with a hunger that had become as familiar as breathing. For weeks, she and her 2 children had survived on watery potato soup and scraps of black bread, watching their once prosperous neighborhood transform into a wasteland of collapsed buildings and abandoned hope. The smell was impossible to ignore. It cut through the stench of destruction like a beacon, drawing her and dozens of other civilians from their hiding places with an almost magnetic pull. 8-year-old Klaus tugged at his mother's threadbare coat sleeve, his sunken eyes wide with desperate longing. "Mama, do you smell that? It smells like before the war." His sister Emma, barely 6 years old, clutched her mother's hand with fingers that seemed too fragile, too thin for a child her age. As documented in the archives of the 3rd Infantry Division's after-action reports, American forces had established a forward field kitchen just 3 blocks from the city center, intending to feed their advancing troops as they consolidated their hold on the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany. Master Sergeant William "Cookie" O'Brien from Chicago had been frying chicken since dawn, preparing for the soldiers who would rotate through for hot meals between patrols through the occupied city. The kitchen itself was a marvel of military efficiency, massive field stoves pumping out heat and steam, enormous pots bubbling with vegetables, and O'Brien's personal pride, cast iron skillets the size of wagon wheels, crackling with golden brown chicken pieces that would have seemed like a fantasy to the starving German population. The 62-year-old mess sergeant had been feeding American boys across Europe for 3 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would witness that morning. Greta found herself part of a growing crowd of hollow-cheeked civilians who had followed the incredible scent through the maze of destroyed streets. They gathered at a respectful distance from the American encampment, afraid to come closer but unable to turn away. These were people who had once lived comfortable middle-class lives, teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers, now reduced to gaunt shadows of their former selves, united only by the universal language of hunger and the tantalizing promise of a real meal. Among them stood Heinrich Weber, a former postal clerk whose wire-rimmed glasses now held cracked lenses, and Martha Schneider, a widow who had lost her husband on the Eastern Front and her home to Allied bombing raids. They watched in silence as American soldiers moved efficiently around the field kitchen, their well-fed faces and clean uniforms a stark contrast to the ragged assembly of German onlookers. The morning air hung thick with tension and possibility. The war was clearly ending, everyone could feel it, but what came next remained terrifyingly uncertain. Would these American soldiers show mercy to the civilian population? Would they share their bounty with former enemies? Or would they simply let the defeated German people starve as retribution for years of war? Sergeant O'Brien had noticed the gathering crowd within minutes of starting his morning preparations. A career soldier who had served in the Great War and re-enlisted when America entered this conflict. He understood hunger in ways that went beyond military rations and mess hall schedules. He had seen it in the faces of French children during the First War, had witnessed it in the hollow stares of liberated prisoners just weeks earlier, and now he recognized it again in these German civilians who watched his every movement with desperate, silent intensity. The standing orders were clear enough. American military supplies were for American military personnel. The field kitchen existed to maintain the fighting strength and morale of the 3rd Infantry Division as they pushed deeper into the collapsing Reich. Every piece of chicken, every potato, every grain of salt had been transported across the Atlantic, trucked through France, and carefully rationed to support the war effort. Feeding enemy civilians was not part of the mission, But O'Brien had children of his own back in Chicago, 2 daughters who would be about the same age as some of the kids he saw in that crowd. Margaret would be 9 now, and little Susan would be 7, assuming they were safe and well-fed while their father fought overseas. He imagined his own girls watching strangers cook food they desperately needed, and the thought made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. According to records maintained by the 3rd Infantry Division Historical Section, the unit had been operating under General Lucian Truscott's directive to maintain strict discipline while treating civilian populations humanely within the bounds of military necessity. This created a complex moral landscape where soldiers were expected to be both conquering victors and compassionate liberators, roles that didn't always align neatly with field conditions. Lieutenant James Patterson, fresh out of West Point and serving as the company's executive officer, approached the field kitchen around 1000 hours that morning. The 23-year-old officer had been conducting a routine inspection of forward positions when he noticed the unusual gathering of civilians. His training had emphasized the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between occupying forces and civilian populations, yet something about the scene before him challenged those neat military categories. "Sergeant," Patterson said quietly, his voice carrying the careful authority of someone still learning to command. "What's your assessment of the situation here?" He nodded toward the crowd of Germans who continued to maintain their respectful distance, though their numbers had grown steadily throughout the morning. O'Brien paused in his cooking, wiping his hands on his apron before answering. "Sir, they're hungry. Been hungry for a long time, from the looks of it. Especially those children." He gestured with his chin toward Klaus and Emma, who had moved slightly closer to the perimeter, their young faces reflecting a mixture of hope and fear that cut straight through military protocol and went directly to something more fundamental in the human experience. The lieutenant found himself caught between competing loyalties to his orders, to military efficiency, to the larger strategic objectives of the occupying force, and to something else entirely that defied easy categorization. These were the people his country had been fighting against for nearly 4 years, the citizens of a regime that had brought unprecedented destruction to the world. Yet looking at them now, he saw only hungry families who bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the communities he had left behind in rural Pennsylvania. The smell of fried chicken continued to fill the air, creating an invisible bridge between 2 groups who had been trained to see each other as enemies. In that moment, surrounded by the ruins of war, ordinary human needs began to assert themselves over the artificial boundaries that conflict had created. Emma Muller had always been the braver of Greta's 2 children, even before the war had stripped away so much of their world. While Klaus tended to retreat into himself when faced with uncertainty, Emma possessed a stubborn determination that reminded Greta of her late husband, Friedrich, who had died defending Stalingrad 3 years earlier. Now, as the tantalizing aroma of fried chicken grew stronger with each passing minute, that same determination began to override the fear that had kept the German civilians at their careful distance. The 6-year-old took one small step forward, then another, her tiny hands clasped behind her back in the formal posture their governess had once insisted upon during better times. Her mother reached out instinctively to stop her, but something in Emma's expression, a mixture of desperate hope and childish logic, made Greta hesitate. Perhaps a child could accomplish what adults could not, could bridge the gap between former enemies through the simple act of innocent need. Emma continued her approach, her worn shoes making soft sounds on the rubble-strewn pavement. She had rehearsed what she would say in her limited English. Words she had learned from her father's business associates before the war had made such international connections impossible. American soldiers noticed her immediately. It was hard to miss such a small figure moving with such purposeful determination through the morning air. Sergeant O'Brien stopped his cooking entirely when he saw her coming. The sight of this tiny girl, dressed in clothes that had once been fine but were now patched and faded, approaching with the dignity of a diplomat on a crucial mission, struck him with unexpected force. She reminded him of his own Susan, who had possessed that same serious expression when she was trying to accomplish something important in her child's world. As documented in personal letters later donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, O'Brien would write to his wife that week, "I saw myself in that little German girl, saw my own daughters, saw every child who ever approached an adult with hope in their eyes and trust in their heart. The moment would stay with him for the rest of his life, a perfect crystallization of humanity's ability to transcend the artificial boundaries that politics and warfare created." Emma stopped exactly 10 feet from the field kitchen, close enough to smell the incredible richness of the cooking food, but far enough to show respect for the American military boundary. She stood perfectly straight, her chin raised with dignity that seemed almost impossible for someone so young and obviously undernourished. When she spoke, her voice carried across the morning air with crystalline clarity. "Please, sir," she said in careful English, her pronunciation heavily accented but unmistakably sincere. "We are very hungry. The children are very hungry." She gestured back toward the crowd of civilians, many of whom were indeed children of various ages, all watching this crucial diplomatic mission with held breath and desperate hope. Lieutenant Patterson felt something shift inside his chest as he watched this scene unfold. His military training had prepared him for combat decisions, for tactical assessments, for the clear moral landscape of soldiers fighting soldiers. It had not prepared him for a 6-year-old German girl who possessed more courage than most of the grown men he had served with, who could stand in the ruins of her destroyed country and ask for help with such quiet dignity. Sergeant O'Brien looked at the lieutenant, then back at Emma, then at the crowd of hungry civilians who had followed the scent of hope through the devastated streets of Nuremberg. In that moment, military protocol seemed less important than the fundamental human obligation to feed the hungry, especially when those hungry included children who bore no responsibility for the war that had brought them to this desperate point. Lieutenant Patterson's military academy training had emphasized the importance of decisive leadership, but nothing in those carefully structured lessons had addressed the moral complexity of a starving 6-year-old girl asking for food in perfect, practiced English. He looked at Sergeant O'Brien, whose weathered face reflected the same internal struggle between duty and humanity that was currently tearing at the young officer's conscience. "Sergeant," Patterson said quietly, moving closer so their conversation wouldn't carry to the waiting civilians, "what's your professional assessment of our supply situation?" It was a carefully neutral question that allowed both men to explore their options without directly challenging military protocol. O'Brien's response was equally measured. "Sir, we're cooking for approximately 200 men today, but I've prepared enough protein for closer to 300, following standard field ratios for potential reinforcement arrivals." He paused, his eyes flickering toward Emma, who continued toast and at perfect attention despite the obvious strain of maintaining such composure while surrounded by the smell of food she desperately needed. "We have sufficient stores to maintain operational capacity while addressing humanitarian considerations." The coded military language couldn't quite mask what both men were really discussing, whether to feed hungry children from their own supplies, potentially violating standing orders about resource allocation while simultaneously fulfilling the larger moral obligations that had brought American forces to Europe in the first place. According to archived reports from the Allied military government for Germany, similar situations were occurring throughout occupied German territory as American forces encountered civilian populations who had been pushed to the edge of starvation by years of total war, strategic bombing, and the collapse of normal food distribution systems. Emma's presence had created a silent crisis of conscience that extended beyond the two American soldiers. In the crowd of German civilians, other parents were watching to see whether their children's desperate hope would be rewarded or crushed. Heinrich Weber adjusted his cracked glasses nervously, while Martha Schneider placed protective hands on the shoulders of two children who weren't even her own, orphans she had taken in after their parents died in a bombing raid. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from New Mexico who had been helping with food preparation, approached his superiors with unusual boldness. "Sir, begging your pardon, but my grandmother always said that feeding hungry children was the most important thing a person could do, no matter what else was happening in the world." His voice carried the slight tremor of a young soldier who wasn't entirely certain he should be speaking, but who couldn't remain silent in the face of what he was witnessing. Patterson realized that his decision would define not only this moment, but his own understanding of what American values actually meant when tested against the messy reality of human need. The war was effectively over, everyone knew it, even if the formal surrender hadn't yet occurred. The question now was what kind of peace would follow, and whether that peace would be built on the foundation of compassion or simply the cold logic of military efficiency. Emma hadn't moved during the Americans' quiet conference, though her slight body showed signs of the effort required to maintain such perfect stillness. Her mother, Greta, watched from the crowd with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing that her daughter's courage might result in either salvation or devastating disappointment for everyone who had followed the smell of hope through the ruins of their city. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as Lieutenant Patterson looked once more at the small girl, then at his sergeant, then at the field kitchen that represented not just military logistics, but the kilole, possibility of human kindness transcending the artificial boundaries that warfare had created. Lieutenant Patterson's decision came not as a dramatic moment of inspiration, but as a quiet recognition of what his country truly stood for beneath all the military protocols and strategic objectives. He had joined the army to fight fascism, to defend freedom, to protect innocent people from tyranny, and the innocent people standing before him were exactly the ones his service was meant to protect, regardless of which side of the conflict had produced their current desperate circumstances. "Sergeant O'Brien," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had found moral clarity in a complex situation, "I want you to prepare plates for these civilians. Start with the children, then the elderly, then anyone else who looks like they need a hot meal." He paused, meeting the older man's eyes with steady confidence. "This is a direct order, and I'll take full responsibility for any questions from higher command." The transformation in Sergeant O'Brien's weathered face was immediate and profound. The internal tension that had been building throughout the morning released in a broad smile that seemed to take 20 years off his age. "Yes, sir," he replied with an enthusiasm that rang across the improvised kitchen area. "Rodriguez, Jenkins, get out every spare plate we have. We're going to feed some hungry people today." Emma's composure finally broke when she realized what was happening. The careful dignity she had maintained throughout her diplomatic mission dissolved into the natural excitement of a 6-year-old who had just accomplished something magnificent. She turned toward the crowd of waiting Germans and called out in her native language, "Sie sagen ja. Die Amerikaner sagen ja." They said yes. The Americans said yes. The reaction among the German civilians was electric. Parents who had maintained careful distance suddenly surged forward, not in a disorganized rush, but in the purposeful movement of people who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Greta Muller reached her daughter first, sweeping Emma into an embrace that conveyed months of accumulated fear, hope, and desperate love. According to documentation preserved in the Nuremberg Municipal Archives, word of the American field kitchen's generosity spread through the civilian population with remarkable speed. Within an hour, the orderly group of 30 or 40 people had grown to nearly 200, including families who had emerged from basement shelters and bombed-out buildings where they had been hiding since the American advance began. Sergeant O'Brien organized his impromptu humanitarian operation with the same efficiency he brought to feeding American troops. He positioned the largest skillets at the front of the line, ensuring that the fried chicken remained hot and appetizing. Private Rodriguez took charge of distributing plates and utensils, while Private First Class Jenkins managed the growing queue with gentle firmness that kept the distribution process orderly without making it feel military or intimidating. The first plate went to Emma, of course partly because of her courage in breaking the ice, but mostly because she was the youngest child in sight and clearly needed the nutrition most desperately. O'Brien loaded her plate with a generous piece of golden brown chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, green beans that had been cooked with actual butter, and a thick slice of white bread that represented luxury beyond anything she had tasted in years. Emma's eyes grew impossibly wide as she accepted the plate with both hands, holding it like a sacred treasure. The smell rising from the hot food was overwhelming after so many months of hunger, and for a moment she simply stood there, breathing in the incredible richness of a real meal prepared with abundance rather than desperation. Her mother, Greta, received the second plate, and the emotion in her face as she looked at the American soldiers who were feeding her children represented something that transcended all the political complexities of war and occupation. This was simple human kindness, the recognition that some obligations like feeding hungry children existed above and beyond national boundaries or military objectives. Heinrich Weber, the former postal clerk, found himself standing next to Martha Schneider, the war widow, as they waited in the growing line. Both had tears in their eyes, though neither spoke about them directly. They had survived years of total war, had watched their world collapse around them, had prepared themselves for whatever harsh treatment the occupying forces might impose. They had not prepared for American soldiers who would share their food with former enemy's children. As the impromptu meal service continued, something remarkable began happening between the American soldiers and the German civilians that went far beyond the simple transaction of distributing food. Language barriers that should have made communication impossible seemed to dissolve in the face of shared smiles, grateful gestures, and the universal experience of watching hungry children finally get to eat. Private Tommy Rodriguez discovered that Heinrich Weber spoke surprisingly good English. Learned during his years working for the German Postal Service before the war had made international correspondence impossible. The two men found themselves engaged in careful conversation about their families, their homes, their hopes for whatever peace might follow this devastation. Weber showed Rodriguez a battered photograph of his son, Hans, who had been killed fighting in France, while Rodriguez shared stories about his own younger brother who was still in school back in New Mexico. The interaction was awkward at first. How do you make small talk with someone whose country you've been fighting for 4 years? But hunger and kindness created a common ground that political differences couldn't entirely eliminate. Weber helped translate for other civilians who wanted to express their gratitude but lacked the English words, while Rodriguez made sure the elderly German woman behind Weber got extra portions because she reminded him of his own grandmother. Emma had finished her first plate with the methodical concentration of someone who understood that this might be her only real meal in weeks. But Sergeant O'Brien noticed her watching other children eat with a slightly wistful expression of someone who is still hungry despite having just eaten. Without asking permission from anyone, he prepared a second, smaller plate for her, this time focusing on the mashed potatoes and bread that would provide the most lasting nutrition. For later, he told her in his limited German, though his meaning was clear enough. Emma's face lit up with such pure joy that several of the watching American soldiers found themselves grinning despite their attempts to maintain military bearing. There was something about a child's happiness that cut through every artificial barrier that war and politics could create. Lieutenant Patterson moved through the crowd, observing the interactions between his men and the German civilians with growing amazement. He had expected tension, awkwardness, perhaps even hostility from people who had recently been enemies. Instead, he was witnessing something that looked remarkably like the formation of community, temporary and fragile but unmistakably real. As documented in oral history interviews conducted by the Nuremberg Historical Society in the 1970s, many of the German civilians present that day would later describe the American field kitchen as their first glimpse of hope that the post-war world might offer something better than endless punishment and privation. Martha Schneider, the war widow, found herself in conversation with Private First Class Jenkins, a farm boy from Iowa whose gentle manner with children reminded her of her late husband during happier times. Jenkins had noticed that she was sharing her own food with two children who weren't her own, and he quietly made sure those children received their own full plates rather than forcing her to sacrifice her nutrition for theirs. The logistics of feeding nearly 200 unexpected guests should have created chaos, but Sergeant O'Brien's organizational skills and the natural cooperation that emerges in humanitarian situations kept everything running smoothly. American soldiers found themselves working alongside German civilians to distribute food, clear tables, and maintain order cooperation that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier when they were still shooting at each other. Klaus Miller, Emma's 8-year-old brother who had been shy and withdrawn since the bombing raids began, gradually emerged from behind his mother's skirts to watch the American soldiers with growing fascination. These men were nothing like the monsters German propaganda had described. They were laughing with children, sharing food with strangers, treating former enemies with basic human decency. The moment represented something larger than emergency food distribution. It was a glimpse of what reconciliation might look like, proof that people who had been taught to hate each other could find common ground in fundamental human values like protecting children and sharing resources with those in need. By early afternoon, news of the American field kitchen's extraordinary generosity had spread through the bombed-out neighborhoods of Nuremberg like wildfire. Family after family emerged from their hiding places in basement shelters, damaged apartments, and makeshift camps in the ruins, drawn not only by the promise of food but by something even more precious, the possibility that their conquerors might treat them with basic human dignity. The crowd had grown beyond anything Lieutenant Patterson could have anticipated when he made his initial decision to feed Emma and the other hungry children. What had started as 30 or 40 civilians had become nearly 400, a diverse cross-section of Nuremberg's surviving population that included everyone from former Nazi Party members who now kept their political affiliations carefully hidden, to Social Democrats who had spent years living in fear, to ordinary citizens who had never cared much about politics and simply wanted their families to survive. Sergeant O'Brien's field kitchen, designed to feed 200 soldiers at maximum capacity, was being stretched far beyond its intended limits. But the career mess sergeant approached the logistical challenge with the same methodical competence he brought to every aspect of military cooking. He dispatched Private Rodriguez to requisition additional supplies from the division's reserve stores, sent Jenkins to round up every spare plate and utensil in the company area, and began stretching his existing food supplies with the creative efficiency that came from decades of feeding large groups on limited resources. According to records maintained by the 3rd Infantry Division's Quartermaster Section, what happened that day technically violated multiple regulations regarding resource allocation and civilian interaction. However, as documented in post-war interviews with division commanders, the incident was later viewed as an early example of the kind of humanitarian leadership that would be essential for successful military occupation and eventual German reconstruction. The expanded crowd brought new challenges and new opportunities for connection between former enemies. Dr. Friedrich Hauptmann, a physician who had lost his medical practice when his hospital was destroyed in bombing raids, found himself treating minor injuries and illnesses among both German civilians and American soldiers using supplies donated by the U.S. Army medics present at the scene. Working alongside Army medic Sergeant Paul Morrison from Detroit, Dr. Hauptmann provided medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of nationality or military affiliation. The two medical professionals communicated in a mixture of English, German, and the universal language of healthcare, finding common ground in their shared commitment to healing rather than harming. Young Emma Muller had become something of an unofficial ambassador between the two groups, her natural confidence and limited English making her perfectly suited to facilitate introductions and translate basic communications. She moved between the American soldiers and German families with the unself-conscious ease of childhood, carrying messages, sharing observations, and generally serving as a bridge between worlds that political circumstances had forced apart. Her brother Klaus, inspired by Emma's example, began helping American soldiers distribute food and clear tables, work that gave him a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from his life since their father's death. The 8-year-old's careful attention to detail and serious demeanor impressed the soldiers, who began teaching him basic English words and including him in their informal conversations. Private Jenkins, the Iowa farm boy, discovered that Heinrich Weber possessed extensive knowledge about local agriculture and food production information that would prove valuable as American occupation forces tried to understand how to help restore normal civilian life to the region. Their conversation evolved from polite small talk to substantive discussion about practical challenges facing the civilian population. The afternoon sun slanted through the smoke and dust that still rose from Nuremberg's damaged buildings, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere around the improvised community that had formed around Sergeant O'Brien's field kitchen. German civilians and American soldiers sat side by side on makeshift benches, sharing food and tentative conversation, creating something that looked remarkably like hope in the midst of devastation. Martha Schneider found herself thinking about her late husband Friedrich, wondering what he would make of this scene: German children laughing with American soldiers, former enemies sharing meals and stories, ordinary human kindness transcending the artificial boundaries that war and propaganda had created. She thought he would approve. As evening approached and the field kitchen began winding down its unprecedented humanitarian operation, Lieutenant Patterson surveyed the scene with a mixture of professional satisfaction and profound personal transformation. The day had challenged every assumption he had brought to military service, forced him to confront the difference between following orders and providing genuine leadership, and shown him possibilities for human connection that transcended the categories of friend and enemy that warfare typically demanded. The numbers told only part of the story. Approximately 400 German civilians fed, countless expressions of gratitude exchanged, dozens of tentative friendships formed between former enemies. But the deeper significance lay in what the day represented for the future of Allied-German relations and the broader question of how victorious nations should treat defeated populations. Sergeant O'Brien, exhausted but deeply satisfied, supervised the cleanup process with his characteristic attention to detail. His improvised humanitarian operation had consumed nearly 3 days' worth of food supplies, stretched his kitchen equipment beyond its design limits, and required creative logistics that would have impressed peacetime restaurant managers. Yet, as he watched German children helping American soldiers wash dishes and stack equipment, he felt more pride in this day's work than in anything he had accomplished during 4 years of military service. Emma Muller, her stomach full for the first time in months and her faith in human kindness restored, helped her mother gather their few possessions as they prepared to return to their basement shelter. But something fundamental had changed in the 6-year-old's understanding of the world. The American soldiers were no longer anonymous enemies from her mother's worried whispers. They were real people with names and faces and stories, people who had shared their food and shown kindness to children who needed help. As documented in personal memoirs published decades later by several participants, the day at the Nuremberg Field Kitchen would be remembered as a pivotal moment that helped shape post-war German-American relations at the most basic human level. The civilians who received food that day became some of the strongest advocates for cooperation with American occupation authorities, while the American soldiers involved carried stories of German humanity and resilience back to their units and eventually to their families in the United States. Heinrich Weber, the former postal clerk, approached Lieutenant Patterson as the crowd began to disperse, carrying with him a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside, the officer found a hand-carved wooden figurine, a soldier feeding a child that Weber had created during the long afternoon using tools he had somehow managed to preserve through years of bombing and displacement. "For you to remember," Weber said in careful English, "that enemies can become friends when we see each other as people, not symbols." Patterson accepted the gift with genuine emotion, understanding that he was receiving something far more valuable than military medals or official commendations. The day's events would have lasting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate hunger relief provided to Nuremberg's civilian population. Word of American soldiers sharing food with German families spread throughout the occupied zone, contributing to a broader understanding that the American occupation would be guided by humanitarian principles rather than purely punitive objectives. Private Rodriguez wrote to his grandmother that evening, describing the day in terms that captured both its immediate significance and its larger meaning. "Today we fed hungry children and discovered that people are people, no matter which side of the war they happen to be born on. I think this is what we were really fighting for all along, the chance to build a world where children don't have to be hungry, where kindness matters more than politics." Emma's courage in approaching the field kitchen, Lieutenant Patterson's decision to break protocol, Sergeant O'Brien's generous spirit, and the spontaneous cooperation between former enemies created a small but significant example of what post-war reconciliation might look like when guided by fundamental human values rather than political calculations. The smell of fried chicken had brought German civilians out of hiding, but what they found was something far more nourishing than food. Proof that compassion could survive even the worst circumstances, that enemies could become friends, and that the future might hold possibilities for peace that transcended the hatred and violence that had dominated their recent experience. Years later, as Germany rebuilt itself as a democratic ally of the United States, many participants would trace the beginning of that transformation back to moments like this one, when ordinary people on both sides chose humanity over hostility, kindness over conflict, and hope over despair. The field kitchen in Nuremberg had served more than food. It had served notice that a different kind of world was possible,